There is a night in April 2001 that Leeds United supporters have never entirely got over. Elland Road under lights in the semi-final of the European Cup. Not a good cup run, the semi-final. 4 teams left in Europe, and one of them was Leeds, with a squad whose average age was about 24. Rio Ferdinand was 22, Harry Kewell was 22, Jonathan Woodgate 21, Alan Smith 20. Ian Hart, Paul Robinson, Stephen McPhail, all kids, all local or nearly local, most of them out of the same academy. In 18 months they had knocked out Milan, Lazio, Anderlecht and Deportivo La Coruna. Every football writer in England was saying the same thing about them. This team hasn't peaked. This team wins something big in 3 or 4 years, once they've grown up. 3 years later, Leeds United had sold their stadium. They had sold the training ground that produced those players. They had sold every footballer worth a fee, some of them at half what they'd paid. They had been relegated out of the Premier League, and they were carrying debts that, at their worst, were reported at close to £100 million. The remarkable thing about this collapse, the thing that separates it from most football disaster stories, is that nobody stole anything. There was no fraud. There was no hidden scheme. Leeds United was destroyed by a decision that was discussed openly, reported in the press at the time, and approved by intelligent people who all agreed it was sensible. They borrowed a fortune against something that hadn't happened yet. Their chairman summed the whole era up in 4 words that have followed him for the rest of his life. He said, "We live the dream. This is what the dream cost. This has gone bust." Rewind 5 years, because you cannot understand the fall without understanding how sudden the rise was. In 1996, Leeds United were nobody's idea of a coming force. They'd won the last First Division title before the Premier League existed, back in 1992, and then drifted, mid-table, dull, occasionally grim. That year they reached a League Cup final and lost it to Aston Villa without managing a single shot on target. Their own fans chanted for the manager to go while the game was still being played. That was Leeds, a big old club with a big old ground going quietly nowhere. What changed was the academy at Thorpe Arch, not gradually all at once. A group of boys came through together who were, by any standard, exceptional, and they arrived at the same moment as a manager willing to gamble on them. David O'Leary took over in 1998, looked at a first-team squad that needed rebuilding, and instead of buying his way out, he simply picked the children. Not one, as a gesture. All of them, everywhere, including in Europe. The press called them O'Leary's babies, which he publicly disliked and privately repeated at every opportunity. And it worked immediately, which is the dangerous part. 4th in 1999, 3rd in 2000 with a semi-final in the UEFA Cup. Then the Champions League campaign of 2001, winning at the San Siro, holding on in Kiev, beating Deportivo, all the way to the last 4. Leeds went from irrelevant to European semi-finalists in 3 seasons. And here is the trap that sits inside any rise that fast. Everyone involved, the board, the manager, the supporters, the press, and eventually the banks, stopped treating it as remarkable and started treating it as normal, as the baseline, as the thing that would obviously continue, because it had never yet stopped. Now the money. By the late 90s, English football had split into 2 economies, and the border between them was the Champions League. Qualify and you receive television money, prize money, gate receipts, and sponsorship uplift worth tens of millions. Miss out, and you got the ordinary Premier League money, which was good, but not that. More importantly, the 2 economies fed themselves. Champions League money bought better players qualified you again, and each year you stayed in, the gap between you and everyone else widened. Get inside the door and you stayed inside. Miss it twice and you were a different kind of club. Leeds understood this perfectly. They understood it earlier and more clearly than most of their rivals, and that is precisely what killed them. Because the conclusion they drew was this: we are a Champions League club now. That money is coming. So why wait for it before we spend it? Spend now, get better now, guarantee the qualification, and the income arrives to cover what we've already committed. Read that reasoning again, because it isn't idiotic. It is the logic of every mortgage and every business loan on earth. You borrow against future income, because the thing you buy generates that income. So Leeds borrowed properly, not overdrafts, but structured, long-dated debt with the club's future revenues pledged as security, including a large securitization raised against future ticket sales repayable over decades. Transfer fees were financed, contracts were signed years forward. In November 2000, they paid £18 million for Rio Ferdinand, a British record for a defender. Robbie Keane, Olivier Dacour, Mark Viduka, Robbie Fowler, Seth Johnson, all arriving, all on Premier League money, all committed against income the club had not yet earned. And this is the single sentence at the heart of the whole story. Leeds United borrowed against a football result, not against a signed broadcast contract, not against a guaranteed payment, against finishing in the top three of the Premier League, an outcome decided by a hamstring, a referee, a fixture list, one poor February, a shot that hits the post instead of the net. Every collapse this channel has covered made a version of that bet. Rangers assumed the trophies would keep paying for the schemes. Portsmouth assumed the owner would keep rating checks. The Royal Bank of Scotland assumed asset prices would keep rising. Leeds assumed the league table. That's what this channel does, by the way. Great institutions, one fatal assumption, and the moment the bill arrives. If that's your kind of thing, subscribe, because there's a new one every week. The 2001-02 season was not a disaster. That's what makes it so instructive. Leeds spent long stretches of it top of the Premier League. In the new year they were being talked about as title contenders. The football was good, the crowd was loud, and the young side that had been to a European semi-final was, on paper, a year better. They finished fifth. Fifth in England is a fine season. For Leeds United it was a catastrophe because fifth meant no Champions League, and no Champions League meant the money underpinning everything did not arrive. Not delayed. Absent. At this point there was still a way out, and it was ugly but survivable. Sell hard, immediately, while the players were worth full price, and while other clubs didn't know you were desperate. Take the pain in one summer, cut the wage bill, drop out of the elite for 2 or 3 seasons, come back solvent. Leeds didn't do that, and it's worth being fair about why. Selling the best players would have guaranteed they never qualified again, which would have guaranteed the debt could never be repaid. So the board chose the option that still contained a version of success. Hold the squad, spend a little more, and get back in. They went into 2002-03 with the same wage bill, the same debt, and the same assumption. And that season was a slow public unraveling. O'Leary was gone by the summer of 2002. Terry Venables arrived and couldn't stop it. The players, most of them barely into their 20s, all of them reading the same financial coverage as the supporters, visibly stopped believing. Leeds finished 15th, 2 seasons without European money. A cost base built for a club in the last 16 of the Champions League. Repayments falling due against revenue that had never existed. That is the moment Leeds United stopped being a football club with debts and became a debt with a football club attached. Before the selling started, there was one contract that came to define the whole era, and it wasn't for a superstar. In October 2001, Leeds signed Seth Johnson, a decent, hard-working midfielder from Derby County for around £7 million. And the story that has followed that transfer around for 25 years is this. Johnson walked into the negotiation prepared to ask for £13,000 a week, and before he could open his mouth, Leeds offered him around £30,000. Both Johnson and the club have pushed back on the precise numbers over the years, and it's only fair to say the tale has grown in the telling. But it stuck for the same reason the goldfish stuck. Because in a 2-year window, Leeds United were not just spending too much. They were spending without anybody in the room asking the most basic question in business. What is the least we could pay for this? When a club stops asking that question, the wage bill doesn't grow, it compounds. Every new contract sets the floor for the next one, and the players already there hear the numbers and want parity. By 2002, Leeds were locked into a wage structure they could not exit without selling everybody. So they sold everybody. Rio Ferdinand went to Manchester United in the summer of 2002 for around £30 million. Of every buyer available, the club captain and England centre-half went to the one club Leeds supporters could least tolerate to cover money already spent. Then Robbie Keane. Then Jonathan Woodgate, sold in January while the manager was publicly promising nobody else would leave. A promise he plainly hadn't been allowed to keep, and which cost him whatever authority he had left. Then Olivier Dacour, Harry Kewell, Lee Bowyer, Nigel Martin. Later Alan Smith, who cried on the pitch at the end, and then signed for Manchester United, which Leeds fans have still not forgiven and probably never will. Each sale was presented as the final one. None of them were. And the pattern is important, because the market knew Leeds were forced sellers. Leeds got forced seller prices. Assets bought at the top of the market went out the door at a discount, which meant more assets had to follow, which confirmed to the market that Leeds were desperate. That loop is what actually empties a club. Peter Ridsdale resigned in March 2003. He has answered for it publicly for 20 years, and to his credit he has never seriously tried to pin it on anyone else. But his phrase, "We lived the dream," outlived every other detail, because English football recognised it instantly as the name for something it had been doing everywhere. Spending tomorrow's money on today's team. And then there are the small things, which are the things people actually remember. The private jets, the company cars, the mobile phone bills. And above all, the story about the tropical fish, that while the club was selling its best players, Leeds United was paying a monthly bill to rent a fish tank for the chairman's office. Now the fish did not bankrupt Leeds United. Against a debt of that size the sum is meaningless, and the details have been disputed for 2 decades. It survived anyway, because it explained something the accounts couldn't. Supporters had watched their club sell a 22-year-old England defender to service a loan, and then heard about the goldfish, and something clicked into place. At some point, the people running this club had stopped being able to tell the difference between what they could afford and what they were owed. If you're enjoying this one, the quickest way to get the next collapse is to subscribe. It's free, and there's a new one every week. The relegation season itself, 2003-04, was one long public execution. Peter Reid started it and was gone by November. Eddie Gray, a Leeds man, a club legend, one of Don Revie's players, took over a squad of teenagers and loanies and was asked to keep a hollowed-out club in the Premier League. He very nearly did. Every home game that season had 2 audiences, the one watching the football and the one reading the business pages. Supporters would arrive at Elland Road, having spent the week seeing their club's finances discussed on the news, and then watch a team of kids try to survive against Arsenal and Chelsea. It ended on the 2nd of May 2004 at Bolton. Leeds lost 4-1 and were relegated from the Premier League. There were grown men in the away end who had been at the Champions League semi-final 3 years earlier, in the same shirts, singing the same songs. And even that wasn't the worst of it, because by then the selling had moved on from players. By 2004, Leeds were disposing of things football clubs are not supposed to own less of. Thorpe Arch went first. The academy, the training ground that had produced Ferdinand, Woodgate, Smith, Hart, Robinson, and later Milner and Lennon. The single asset that had generated everything good in the previous decade was sold for a reported £4.2 million and leased back. Sit with that for a second. The machine that made the players was sold to pay the debts incurred by spending the money the players had brought in. And then Elland Road, home since 1919, sold in 2004 for around £8 million and rented back, so that Leeds United now paid a landlord for the right to play at Elland Road. £8 million, less than half what they had paid for one defender 4 years earlier. The accounts for that period showed losses approaching £30 million. A consortium of local businessmen put £5 million in and borrowed 15 more, almost all of which went straight to creditors. It wasn't a rescue, it was a slower fall. In January 2005, Ken Bates bought the club, and the years that followed were, if anything, harder to follow than the collapse itself. A decade of complicated ownership structures, offshore holding companies, and a fan base that spent as much time trying to work out who actually owned Leeds United as it did watching the team. In 2007, Leeds entered administration and were docked 10 points, dropping into League One, the 3rd tier, for the first time in the club's history. The Football League then imposed a further 15-point deduction over the way the club exited administration. Leeds United, European Cup semi-finalists in 2001, began the 2007-08 season on minus 15 points in the 3rd division of English football. And here, in the middle of the wreckage, Leeds supporters got one afternoon back. 3rd of January 2010, FA Cup 3rd round, Leeds United of League One away at Manchester United, the club that had bought Ferdinand and Smith and had spent a decade as the measure of everything Leeds had lost. Jermaine Beckford scored. Leeds won 1-0 at Old Trafford. It changed nothing financially. It didn't reduce the debt by £1 or bring the stadium back. But if you want to understand why any of this matters, why people put themselves through decades of this, it's that afternoon. Thousands of Leeds fans in the corner of Old Trafford, most of whom had watched everything they loved get sold in instalments, singing at a club 3 divisions above them that they had just beaten. Football clubs are not businesses that happen to have supporters. They are supporters who happen to fund a business. That distinction is the entire reason these collapses hurt the way they do. They went up from League One that year. It took another decade to get all the way back, 16 years outside the Premier League in total. A child born the month Elland Road was sold could have left school before Leeds United returned, and the ground stayed in other people's hands for 2 decades. The club clawed back control in stages, and full ownership of Elland Road was only restored in 2024, 20 years after that £8 million sale. 20 years to undo one afternoon of paperwork. Quick one before the ending. If you've got a club whose collapse you want covered, put it in the comments. Most of the stories on this channel came from someone down there asking for them. So what actually killed Leeds United? Not the fish tank, not the Jets, not Seth Johnson's contract, and not O'Leary's tactics or Venable's team selection or any of the things that were argued about at the time. Leeds died of a structure, and the structure had one flaw, which was that it contained no version of an ordinary season. Every football club spends more than it comfortably earns. That isn't the sin. The sin was funding that gap with long-term debt whose repayment depended on repeatedly finishing in the top 3. 5th place is not a disaster. 5th place is the most normal thing in football. It happens to everyone, constantly, for reasons nobody controls. Leeds built a financial machine in which the most normal outcome in the sport was fatal. That is the pattern, and it is why these stories keep repeating in different clouds. The Royal Bank of Scotland needed asset prices to keep rising. Portsmouth needed one man to keep signing checks. Rangers needed the winning to keep funding the schemes. Gretna needed one man's health to hold. Leeds needed to keep finishing third. None of them were run by fools. They were run by capable, confident people who built something that only worked in one direction, and were then genuinely astonished when the world went the other way, because it had gone their way for so long that the other direction had stopped feeling real. Here's the part that stays with me. Those supporters at Elland Road in April 2001, watching a European Cup semi-final under the lights, believed they were watching the beginning of something. They weren't. They were watching the whole thing at once. The peak, already bought, already borrowed against, already spent. The bill for that night was in the post before the players were off the pitch. Leeds survived, and that matters. They're back in the Premier League. They own their ground again. But it cost 20 years, 2 administrations, 3 divisions, an entire golden generation sold off in pieces, and every asset the club possessed. Because somebody, in a very good year, was completely certain the good years would continue. Nobody has ever borrowed against a future they thought was uncertain. That is the whole problem. If you want the next one, a club, a bank, or an empire that made exactly this mistake, subscribe. There's a new collapse here every week, and the next one is already on screen.